The year was 1945. Germany was collapsing under the weight of its own war. Cities burned, rail lines were shattered, and Allied bombers ruled the skies. But in the middle of the chaos, in the north of the country, something enormous was stirring. A patrol of Allied fighters flew low over the countryside near Hamburg. The war was almost over, yet the pilots still had orders to remain alert. Then, through the clouds and mist, one of them saw a shadow moving across the surface of a lake. It was not a ship. It was too large, too smooth, and it was floating perfectly still. As they flew closer, the pilots could hardly believe their eyes. Below them sat a flying boat so massive that it looked like a floating fortress. Its wings stretched almost 200 feet from tip to tip. Its 6 engines were silent now, but each one was big enough to power an entire fighter plane. The aircraft's hull gleamed faintly under the grey sky. Rumours spread quickly among the Allied ranks. Some believed it was a secret Nazi escape craft built to fly Adolf Hitler and his closest circle to South America. Others thought it was a long-range bomber, a weapon meant to strike New York City from across the Atlantic. But whatever it was, it represented something extraordinary, a final attempt by Germany's engineers to defy defeat with pure ambition. The aircraft was called the Blohm & Voss BV-238, and it was unlike anything the world had ever seen. It was the largest airplane ever built by the Axis powers. When fully loaded, it weighed more than 100 tons, heavier than anything the Luftwaffe had ever put into the air. It was a flying ship, capable of carrying troops, fuel, and even vehicles across oceans. It was the last dream of a regime that was falling apart, a machine designed in a world that no longer existed. The story of the BV-238 begins not in the sky, but in the shipyards of Hamburg. For decades, the company Blohm & Voss had built some of the greatest ships in Germany. Their steel hulls carried trade and power across the seas. When the Nazi regime came to power, the company's skills were redirected toward the war effort. The oceans were no longer a place for trade, they were battlefields. But Blohm & Voss had something that few shipbuilders did. They had a visionary mind. Dr. Richard Vogt, an engineer with bold ideas and an obsession with pushing limits. He believed the skies could be conquered the same way the seas had been with size, endurance, and strength. As the war intensified, Vogt looked at the vast Atlantic Ocean and the endless supply routes that fed the Allied forces. Germany's U-boats prowled those waters, but they could not reach far enough or long enough to break the enemy's lifelines. Vogt imagined an aircraft so large that it could fly over the entire ocean, refuel submarines, deliver men and weapons, and return without needing a base. It would be part airplane, part ship, and entirely revolutionary. In the winter of 1941, he presented his idea to the German Ministry of Aviation. The officials were stunned by its scale, but Hitler's engineers were encouraged to dream big. The order was given. Work on the BV-238 began soon after. While the cities below crumbled under bombing raids, engineers inside Blohm & Voss's massive hangars drew blueprints for the largest flying machine the Reich had ever imagined. Riveters worked day and night, welding frames the size of houses. The design took shape slowly, piece by piece, until by 1943, a single monstrous airframe stood ready, a machine that dwarfed even the famous Allied bombers. The Allied pilots who discovered it near the end of the war had no idea what they were looking at. All they knew was that it could not be allowed to fly. What they saw that day was not just an airplane. It was the ghost of a dying empire, a final symbol of a nation that had gambled everything on technology and power. And though it never fulfilled its purpose, the BV-238 remains one of the most haunting creations of World War II. Its story begins long before that last flight, in a time when Germany's engineers believed that the future could still be won with steel, engines, and impossible dreams. To understand how such a colossal machine came to exist, we must go back more than half a century before it was built to a shipyard on the River Elbe in Hamburg, Germany. It was the year 1877. Two ambitious men, Hermann Blohm and Ernst Voss, founded a shipbuilding company that would soon become one of the most respected names in European industry. Their first ships were small cargo vessels and passenger liners, but their skill for precision engineering and their ability to work with massive steel structures quickly made their reputation grow. For decades, Blohm & Voss built ships that sailed across every ocean. Their shipyard became a symbol of German craftsmanship and power. When the First World War erupted, the company turned its industrial strength to building warships for the Imperial German Navy. But after Germany's defeat in 1918, everything changed. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, struck hard at Germany's pride and potential. It stripped the nation of much of its military power and strictly forbade the development of a modern air force. For a country that had once been at the cutting edge of aviation during the war, it was a humiliating blow. Yet the engineers and visionaries of Germany were not so easily silenced. Across the nation, workshops, research centers, and small factories continued to experiment in secret. They built gliders and civilian aircraft designs that could be quickly converted into military use when the time came. By the early 1930s, as Adolf Hitler rose to power, the restrictions of Versailles were openly ignored. The new regime wanted to restore German dominance through rearmament and technology. Air power became a symbol of strength and modernity. Blohm and Voss saw their opportunity. Under the leadership of Hermann Blohm's sons, Rudolf and Walter Blohm, the company decided to expand from ships to aircraft. They already possessed enormous facilities, engineering talent, and a long history of working with metal. All they needed was expertise in aviation design. They found it in a brilliant but unconventional engineer, Dr. Richard Vogt. Vogt had studied in the United States and Japan, learning modern design philosophies that blended innovation with practicality. He believed that aircraft could be built the same way as ships, with sturdy frames, modular designs, and a focus on endurance. When he joined Blohm and Voss, he brought a spirit of experimentation that quickly set the company apart. By the mid-1930s, Vogt's team was already producing prototypes for Lufthansa and the Luftwaffe. Among their early successes were flying boats aircraft that could take off and land on water, ideal for long-distance travel across oceans and remote regions. One of their most famous designs was the BV-138, a sleek reconnaissance flying boat nicknamed the Flying Clog by its crews. It was not beautiful, but it was reliable, rugged, and capable of flying vast distances. The success of these early models convinced Vogt that the future of aviation lay not only in speed and agility, but also in endurance and building aircraft that could carry heavy loads across entire oceans without stopping. When World War II broke out in 1939, Blohm and Voss became a key supplier for the Luftwaffe. Their aircraft patrolled the Atlantic and the North Sea, hunting enemy ships and submarines. But as the war expanded, Vogt wanted to go further. He began to dream of a machine that could change the balance of power, a giant flying boat that could reach any part of the world. He looked at the success of the BV-222 Viking, a large transport aircraft that could carry over 90 passengers or 12 tons of cargo. The Viking proved that even in wartime, long-range flying boats could perform vital missions, transporting supplies, evacuating troops, and even carrying VIPs. But the Viking, in Vogt's mind, was only the beginning. He imagined an aircraft twice its size, one that could fly from Germany to South America without refueling, one that could carry entire tank sections, dozens of soldiers, or huge amounts of fuel for U-boats waiting in the Atlantic. He saw it as the perfect hybrid, part ship, part aircraft, a bridge between two worlds. By 1941, as Germany still believed victory was within reach, Vogt presented his proposal to the Reichsluftfahrtministerium, the German Air Ministry. The officials listened carefully. They had already seen what Blohm and Voss could do, but even they were shocked by the scale of what Vogt described. The project was approved, though cautiously. The ministry ordered Vogt to first build a quarter-scale prototype to test his theories. A Czechoslovakian company was assigned to build it. The model, called FJP 227, was tested in Prague, a miniature of the giant to come. Though the results were disappointing, Vogt did not give up. He believed the flaws could be solved when scaled up. In early 1942, construction of the full-size BV-238 began inside the massive Hamburg shipyard. Around the world, the war was beginning to turn against Germany. But inside those walls, Vogt and his engineers worked as if time itself had paused. They were building something that defied logic, a flying boat so large that no runway could hold it. It could only live on the water. The workers called it Der Fliegende Koloss, the Flying Colossus. Piece by piece, the dream began to take shape. Rivets clanged, engines were tested, and the largest wings ever built by the Axis powers began to stretch across the assembly hall. The Blohm and Voss shipyard had come full circle from building ocean vessels to building a machine that would sail through the skies themselves. And yet, no one in that hangar could have imagined that by the time their creation was finished, Germany would already be losing the war. By 1942, the world was on fire. German forces were stretched across Europe, North Africa, and deep into the Soviet Union. The Reich seemed vast, but the cracks had already begun to show. Supplies were short, fuel was running low, and Allied bombers were now striking German cities almost daily. Yet in a quiet hangar on the edge of Hamburg, something extraordinary was being born. Dr. Richard Vogt stood before his engineers with a blueprint that looked more like the outline of a ship than an airplane. The wingspan stretched nearly 200 feet. 6 massive engines lined each side of the wing roots. Beneath the main deck was a cavernous hull strong enough to carry tons of cargo and fuel. Vogt's voice echoed through the hall as he explained the plan. "This," he said, "will not just be an aircraft. It will be a fleet by itself, a fortress of the skies." The Blohm & Voss BV-238 was meant to be more than a military transport. Vogt envisioned it as a strategic lifeline, a machine that could cross the Atlantic Ocean, supply German U-boats in mid-sea, or carry critical cargo to distant allies. It could even act as a floating refueling station for smaller aircraft. The aircraft's immense size was not for prestige, it was born from necessity. By then, the Allied blockade had made overseas transport nearly impossible. Submarines and long-range aircraft were Germany's only link to the outside world. If the war was to continue, the Reich needed something capable of breaking through the isolation, something that could carry supplies across the vast ocean without landing on a runway. Vogt and his engineers studied every major flying boat in existence. They analyzed the American Sikorsky's 42, the British short Sunderland, and their own successful BV-222 Viking. Each of these aircraft had proven valuable, but none had the range or capacity that Germany now required. The BV-238 would be an entirely new class of machine. Its fuselage was designed like a ship's hull, long and narrow to cut through the water. Inside, 2 decks divided the space, the upper deck for pilots, mechanics, and crew stations, and the lower for cargo, equipment, and living quarters. Vogt even included sleeping bunks, a galley, and a repair workshop, allowing the crew to live aboard during long patrols. At its heart, the aircraft would be powered by 6 Daimler-Benz DB603 engines, each producing nearly 1,750 horsepower. These engines, mounted in 3 pairs along the wings, would give the BV-238 the strength to lift over 100 tons of weight. The wings were so thick that a man could walk through them to reach the engines during flight. The concept was staggering, a blend of shipbuilding and aviation design. The aircraft's structure used tubular steel spars that doubled as fuel tanks, a feature that saved space and added strength. The wings' internal ribs were reinforced with aluminum alloys to reduce weight without compromising durability. As construction continued, every detail was refined for efficiency. The hull was fitted with 2 large floats under each wing for stability on water. A hatch at the nose would open upward, allowing vehicles or supplies to be loaded directly inside. Behind it sat the cockpit, a tall, glass-domed command center that gave the pilots a clear view over the sea below. The planned crew of 12 included 2 pilots, 2 mechanics, a navigator, a radio operator, and several gunners. The aircraft's defensive armament was equally impressive. Twin 20mm cannons in nose and tail turrets, 4 13mm machine guns mounted on each side, and additional gun positions across the fuselage. It was designed to defend itself even against fighter attacks, a true flying fortress. By the summer of 1943, the main airframe was complete. The massive wings were joined to the fuselage inside the shipyard's assembly hall. Each engine nacelle was carefully fitted, and the control systems were tested repeatedly. Workers stood beneath it like ants under a mountain. When they rolled it out for the first time, even hardened Luftwaffe officers stopped to stare. The BV-238 was breathtaking. Its size defied comprehension. At over 100 tons fully loaded, it dwarfed every German aircraft built before it. Inside the cockpit, the smell of oil and fresh paint filled the air. Test instruments lined the panels, and behind them, narrow ladders connected the decks. Every detail was built by hand. Every rivet carried the mark of urgency. Vogt walked alongside the finished hull, his hand brushing against the cold metal skin. Years of dreaming, sketching, and arguing with officials had finally become real. The BV-238 was ready to take to the skies. But not everyone in the Reich shared his enthusiasm. Some officers questioned the value of such a massive aircraft when Germany's fuel reserves were nearly gone. Others argued that fighters and bombers were more important than transports. But Vogt refused to abandon his vision. He believed that even in defeat, Germany had to prove what it was capable of building. The BV-238 would be that proof. It was more than a weapon. It was a statement that even in ruin, German engineering could still reach beyond imagination. The first flight was scheduled for 1943. Mechanics filled the tanks, tested the controls, and checked each engine. The lake near Hamburg waited silently, reflecting the towering form of the aircraft resting on its surface. The world had seen powerful planes before, but nothing like this. As dawn broke over the water, the 6 Daimler-Benz engines roared to life, shaking the ground beneath them. Waves rippled across the lake. The aircraft began to move, slowly at first, then faster, until its massive hull lifted free of the water. For a few brief moments, it floated upward, a steel leviathan leaving its birthplace behind. The impossible had become real. But as the BV-238 climbed into the sky for the first time, few realized it would also be the last great creation of the Luftwaffe. The war was turning. The Allies were advancing on every front, and time was running out. What began as a dream of victory would soon become a desperate symbol of a dying empire. The Blohm & Voss BV-238 was not just another military aircraft. It was a statement of engineering power, the ultimate creation of a nation obsessed with size, precision, and control. To understand its full scale, one must imagine a machine that looked more like a warship with wings than a conventional airplane. When engineers at Blohm & Voss began designing its core structure, they faced challenges that no German aircraft designer had ever encountered. The aircraft had to be enormous but light enough to lift off from water. It had to be strong enough to withstand the stress of 6 massive engines, yet aerodynamic enough to glide across oceans. And it had to be stable on the surface of lakes and seas during fueling and loading operations. The result was one of the most complex pieces of machinery ever created during the Second World War. The BV-238's wingspan measured almost 60 meters, that is nearly 200 feet from one wingtip to the other. Its length was over 43 meters, and its height from the keel to the top of the tail exceeded 10 meters. When it rested on the water, the aircraft towered above small boats nearby, casting a shadow like a floating hangar. It weighed about 100 tons when fully loaded, making it the heaviest aircraft in the world at that time, surpassing even the American Boeing B-29 and the Soviet Tupolev Ant-20. To make something that heavy fly required extraordinary design ingenuity. At the center of the BV-238 were its 6 Daimler-Benz DB603 engines. Each engine was a 12-cylinder, inverted V-type powerhouse producing between 1,750 and 1,900 horsepower. These engines were arranged in 3 pairs, mounted in large nacelles across the leading edge of the wings. Each pair sat inside what the engineers called a power egg, a modular engine compartment that could be replaced or repaired with relative ease. Underneath each engine nacelle was a series of radiators that cooled the liquid-fueled engines during long flights. These radiators were protected by cowlings shaped like chins that gave the plane its distinctive front-heavy look. The roar of 6 synchronized engines would have been deafening a sound unlike anything else in the Luftwaffe. The wing structure itself was a masterpiece. Voigt's team built it around a tubular steel main spar that also served as an armored fuel tank. This innovation saved space and protected the most volatile part of the aircraft, its fuel from enemy fire. The wings were large enough for mechanics to crawl through them during flight, performing maintenance on engines or hydraulic systems in midair. Inside the aircraft, the space was divided into 2 decks. The upper deck housed the flight crew pilots, navigators, engineers, and gunners. It contained the cockpit, which was enclosed in a large, framed canopy giving a panoramic view over the sea. The instrument panel was advanced for its time, featuring multiple dials, pressure gauges, and fuel flow indicators for each of the 6 engines. Directly behind the cockpit was the radio operator's station and the navigator's table, lined with maps and plotting tools. The lower deck was primarily for cargo and storage. It was equipped with tie-down points for securing crates, ammunition, or even small vehicles. There were sleeping bunks for the crew, a small galley with a pressure stove, and a compact workshop where in-flight repairs could be made. The design reflected both the aircraft's naval heritage and its purpose as a self-sufficient flying outpost. The hull was designed like a boat's keel, long and slim, with a reinforced bottom made to withstand impact during water landings. When parked on a lake or coastal bay, the aircraft was kept stable by 2 retractable wing floats that folded up into the underside of each wing once airborne. Its defensive armament was extensive. Voigt intended the BV-238 to be capable of defending itself against Allied patrol planes and fighters. The aircraft carried multiple turrets. A twin 20mm MG-151 cannon turret on the nose, a similar twin 20mm turret on the tail, two quad 13mm MG-131 machine gun turrets mounted dorsally, additional side-mounted guns along the fuselage. If needed, it could carry 6.2, 400-kilogram bombs or torpedoes for anti-shipping missions. In theory, the BV-238 could attack convoys, sink warships, or even bomb distant ports. The aircraft's range was another engineering triumph. It could fly nearly 6,000 miles without refueling, enough to reach Africa or cross the Atlantic Ocean. It cruised at a speed of around 220 miles per hour, with a maximum ceiling of approximately 23,000 feet. For such a large aircraft, these figures were extraordinary. Vogt's ambitions did not stop there. He proposed a land-based version, called the BV-238 Land, equipped with retractable landing gear instead of a boat hull. This version would have been capable of long-range bombing and transatlantic reconnaissance. It was to feature two massive bomb bays and the capacity to carry up to 300 troops. The nose section would fold downward to create a ramp, allowing vehicles to drive directly into the fuselage. But this version was never built. Every new component of the BV-238 revealed both genius and struggle. Production in wartime Germany was chaotic. Resources were scarce, and factories were under constant threat of bombing. Finding enough aluminum, steel, and fuel for a project of this scale was nearly impossible. Yet, against all odds, Vogt's team completed the first prototype by 1943. When the BV-238 was finally assembled, the technicians nicknamed it Der Gigant der Luft, the giant of the skies. It stood on the water like an enormous mechanical creature, sleek and powerful. Workers described its first engine test as thunder rolling across the lake. When the 6 propellers began turning together, the surface of the water trembled. Even the Luftwaffe officers who inspected it were amazed. Some compared it to the American Hughes H-4 Hercules, though that aircraft was still on paper at the time. Others saw it as Germany's last chance to control the skies over the oceans. But behind the admiration was also uncertainty. By the time the BV-238 took shape, the war was turning decisively against Germany. The Allies were bombing Hamburg relentlessly. Factories were destroyed faster than they could be rebuilt. Vogt knew that if his creation was to fly, it would have to do so quickly before it was buried under the ruins of war. Still, he pressed forward. Every test flight, every engine run, every refinement was done with the knowledge that the end was approaching. In the late summer of 1943, as Allied bombers filled the skies above Europe, the BV-238 rolled down the slipway into the waters of Lake Chelsea. Engineers and soldiers watched in silence as it floated free for the first time. In that moment, they were no longer building for war or politics. They were witnessing the peak of German engineering, a flying colossus that represented both human brilliance and the futility of ambition in the face of defeat. What happened next would seal the fate of the largest aircraft the Axis powers ever built. By the time the BV-238 touched the surface of Lake Chelsea for its first tests, Germany was already crumbling from within. The year was 1943. Allied bombers filled the skies day and night. The Reich's factories were smoking ruins, its fuel reserves were running dry, and the Luftwaffe was losing the ability to defend its own homeland. And yet, in the middle of this collapse, Dr. Richard Vogt and his team at Blohm and Voss pressed on. They had built something that defied reason, a machine so massive that few believed it could even fly. The BV-238 prototype, marked Rho plus Airs, was prepared for its first flight under total secrecy. The hangars were guarded by armed soldiers, and only a handful of high-ranking officials were allowed to witness the tests. Vogt himself stood on the shoreline, wearing his long engineer's coat, his eyes fixed on the water. The morning was cold and silent. Mist rose from the lake as mechanics checked the engines one last time. The 6 Daimler-Benz engines sat like beasts at rest, their metal surfaces gleaming with frost. Inside the cockpit, the test pilot gave a final nod. When the engines came alive, the roar shook the valley. Waves spread outward from the aircraft's hull as if something enormous had awakened beneath the surface. The noise was unlike anything the onlookers had ever heard, a thunderous chorus of synchronized power. Slowly, the BV-238 began to move. The water beneath it churned into white foam. Its bow lifted as the engines reached full throttle. For a moment, it seemed the aircraft would never break free. Then, with a heavy spray of water, it began to rise. The crowd on the shore fell silent. The world's heaviest aircraft, a machine weighing over 100 tons, lifted itself into the air. Observers described the sight as almost surreal. Despite its immense size, the BV-238 climbed smoothly, its 6 propellers slicing through the clouds. It moved like a steel whale gliding through a grey ocean of air. Vogt stood motionless, hands clasped behind his back, as his creation disappeared into the mist. For that brief moment, he felt triumph. He had achieved what few thought possible. He had made the largest aircraft in Axis history fly. The flight lasted less than an hour, but it was successful. The controls responded perfectly, the engines held steady, and the plane handled surprisingly well. When it landed, it touched the water with the grace of a giant swan. The Luftwaffe officers present congratulated Vogt, but the celebration was quiet. Germany's situation was worsening by the day, and resources were disappearing faster than any engineer could request them. Still, Vogt believed the BV-238 could change something. He envisioned it as a supply lifeline, a long-range transport capable of crossing oceans when ships could not. Over the next months, additional test flights followed, each one refining the controls and adjusting the balance of the aircraft. The BV-238 could reach speeds of more than 350 kilometers per hour and stay airborne for over 20 hours. Its enormous fuel tanks gave it a range that no other German aircraft could match, but its purpose remained uncertain. Inside the Luftwaffe High Command, there were heated debates about what to do with it. Some officers wanted to use it as a U-boat resupply craft, capable of landing in remote parts of the Atlantic to refuel submarines and deliver torpedoes. Others saw it as a strategic transport, a way to carry supplies to German positions in Norway, North Africa, or even South America. More ambitious planners proposed using it as a long-range bomber, capable of flying to New York, dropping its payload, and returning across the ocean. But the BV-238's size and slow climb rate made such missions nearly impossible. It was not built for speed or combat, it was built to endure. Still, rumors began to circulate throughout Germany that the aircraft had a more secret role. Some whispered that it was being prepared as an escape plane for the highest Nazi officials, perhaps even Adolf Hitler himself. Its range and load capacity could easily make it capable of reaching neutral countries or faraway destinations like Argentina or Brazil. The Allies were not unaware of these rumors. Intelligence reports from late 1944 mentioned a massive German flying boat seen near Hamburg. Reconnaissance photos showed a huge shadow moored on Lake Schalsee, too large to be mistaken for any known aircraft. Allied commanders feared it might be used to evacuate Nazi leaders before the war ended. The British Royal Air Force began monitoring the region. American pilots flying P-51 Mustangs were also told to be on alert for any large aircraft operating near northern Germany. The BV-238 had gone from an engineering marvel to a strategic threat, a symbol of what might happen if the Nazis tried to flee. Meanwhile, Vogt continued his work in silence. He knew the end was near, but he refused to abandon his creation. Every new test was more dangerous than the last. Allied bombers flew overhead almost daily, and each time the aircraft took off, there was the risk of being spotted. One winter morning in 1944, the BV-238 made what many believe was its final official test flight. Witnesses said it rose higher than before, banking gently over the forests before disappearing into the clouds. The sound of its engines echoed for minutes after it vanished. When it returned, the test pilot climbed out of the cockpit, his face covered in sweat and soot. He turned to Vogt and said simply, "It flies like a ship at sea, heavy but steady." Vogt smiled faintly. He knew that was the highest praise any engineer could hope for. But outside the hangar, the world was collapsing. Hamburg had been bombed into ruins. Fuel was almost impossible to find. The BV-238 remained moored in its lake hangar, protected as best as it could be under camouflage nets. As the war approached its end, it became less a project and more a myth, a secret that few had seen but everyone had heard of. Allied reconnaissance pilots continued to report sightings of a giant flying boat in northern Germany. Intelligence officers in London and Washington began to ask the same question. Was this aircraft real? And if it was, what would the Germans do with it when the war was lost? The answer would come soon enough, and it would not be found in the sky, but in flames. Spring 1945. The war was ending, but chaos filled the air. Allied troops were sweeping across Germany from both east and west, and every hour brought new surrenders. The cities that once symbolized German power now lay in ruins. Amid that destruction, one last secret still floated quietly on the surface of a lake in northern Germany. The Blohm & Voss BV-238, the largest aircraft the Axis powers had ever built, remained hidden under camouflage nets on Lake Schalsee, east of Hamburg. Its engines had not run in months. Its paint was faded, and its wings were streaked with dirt and ash from nearby bombings. Yet it was still intact, and to the Allied forces, it represented something far more dangerous than a mere prototype. There were rumors that Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary, had considered using it to flee Europe. Some believed the plane could fly as far as Argentina or Spain, carrying key Nazi officials and stolen gold. Whether those plans were ever real or just desperate imagination, no one knows. But by the last days of the war, the BV-238 had become a symbol of fear, the possibility that the enemy might escape. In early May, Allied reconnaissance planes spotted the massive shape on the water. It was too large to mistake for a ship. From above, it looked like a floating fortress, almost unreal against the calm lake. Orders were given to destroy it immediately. There are several accounts of what happened next, and even now, the truth remains uncertain. According to British reports, the Royal Air Force sent a formation of Hawker Typhoon and Hawker Tempest fighters to the area between May 3rd and May 4th, 1945. They flew low over the lake, looking for hidden aircraft. When they saw the enormous shape below them, one pilot radioed back, "It looks like a ship, but it has wings." The Typhoons dived, their cannons blazing. Tracers tore across the water, striking the aircraft's hull. The first bursts hit near the engines, and black smoke erupted from the surface. Flames spread quickly across the wings. The BV-238 began to tilt, its engines exploding one by one. Within minutes, the giant aircraft was engulfed in fire. The pilots circled once more to confirm the kill, then turned back toward base. Below them, the burning wreck slowly sank, its vast wings disappearing under the surface until only a single tip remained above the lake. But the American version tells a different story. U.S. records claim that months earlier in September 1944, three P-51 Mustang fighters from the 361st Fighter Group spotted the BV-238 during a patrol. The lead pilot, Lieutenant Urban Ben Drew, mistook it for a smaller BV-222 Viking and ordered an attack. The Mustangs strafed it repeatedly until it burst into flames and sank. Years later, Drew insisted he destroyed a German flying boat that day, but he never knew it was the BV-238 until long after the war. Both versions might hold pieces of the truth. Perhaps there were multiple attacks, or perhaps memories blurred in the smoke of war. What is certain is that by May 1945, the BV-238 was gone. When British troops entered the region, they found only the shattered remains of the aircraft, half submerged in the lake. The water was slick with oil, and charred aluminum fragments floated like dead leaves. Engineers from the Allied forces inspected the wreck and were astonished by its size. Some even believed it could have rivaled the Hughes H-4 Hercules, which would not fly until years later. In the late 1940s, the wreckage was deliberately blown up to clear the area. Divers salvaged what they could, but most of it was scrapped. By 1948, nothing remained except memories and scattered photographs. Dr. Richard Vogt survived the war. After being captured by the Allies, he was questioned about his projects. American engineers were deeply interested in his designs, especially the BV-238's structural innovations. Eventually, Vogt immigrated to the United States, where he continued his career in aviation research. He would later work for companies that built the next generation of jet aircraft, a strange twist of fate for the man who once built the last great propeller-driven giant of the Third Reich. Blohm & Voss itself was in ruins. The shipyards had been bombed repeatedly, but the company eventually rebuilt after the war, returning to its roots in shipbuilding. It continued producing vessels for commercial and industrial use, distancing itself from its wartime past. Decades later, historians would uncover evidence that the company had used forced labor from nearby camps during the war. A small memorial now stands near the site, a quiet reminder of those who suffered to build machines they never understood. The BV-238 became a ghost story among aviation historians. There were no surviving blueprints, no preserved parts, and only a handful of blurry photographs. Yet its legend persisted, not because it changed the course of the war, but because it symbolized something deeper than the limits of human ambition. It was born in a time when engineers believed that bigger always meant better, that power could be measured in wingspan and horsepower. But as the BV-238 sank beneath the waters of Lake Chalcis, it carried with it the final illusion of the Nazi war machine, the belief that technology alone could save a dying empire. For a few short flights, it had been the largest aircraft in the world, a steel leviathan that ruled no skies, fought no battles, and yet left its mark on history. And as the war faded into silence, the lake kept its secret. Beneath its still surface rested the twisted remains of Germany's greatest aircraft, the final dream of a nation at war with the world and with itself.